Goblin Slayer is a work of art. It's a series of dark fantasy media, including the flagship light novel series that debuted in 2016, an anime TV series based on the flagship light novel, a manga based on the flagship light novel, an anime film, 2 spin-off light novel series, 4 spin-off mangas, a well-reviewed tabletop RPG, a mobile game, and a browser-based RPG. The second season of the anime is scheduled to air in October of 2023. Also, a turn-based tactical RPG video game I'm personally really looking forward to playing called Goblin Slayer Another Adventure, Nightmare Feast, which is also being overseen by the series creator Kumo Kagyu, is set to release in the winter on the Nintendo Switch and PC in English and in Japanese. The series is often reduced to or characterized by its beginning, which is extremely violent. There's really no avoiding it since it conveys the threat of goblins so well, and chances are, love it or hate it, anybody familiar with Goblin Slayer has watched the first episode or read the first chapter. In this video, I will be talking about the entirety of the series as I understand it as of August 2023. Just so everybody knows what this means, I've read all the light novels I could find in English, including the spin-offs, watched all the anime, the film, and while I skipped the manga based on the flagship light novel series I had already read, I did read the spin-off mangas. There's no avoiding small spoilers in this video, but I won't go into extraordinary depth, and the footage I used for this video will be relatively tame compared to the dark fantasy nature of Goblin Slayer. Something that Goblin Slayer does that no other anime, manga, or light novel I've ever read does is name the characters either after their character class or their social status. This gives the entire story an intended tabletop RPG coat of paint, and it also sort of detaches the reader or viewer from the characters themselves. It doesn't sound like a good thing until the story shifts its focus to the point of view of completely different characters, or even sometimes humorously to the goblins before they have a very bad day.
These goblin critters came to my village. If something don't happen, they'll eat my cows and burn my fields to ashes.
Rest assured, an adventurer will come out to your farm to take care of the problem soon.
Is it really true those little monsters treat women like their playthings and then eat them up afterwards?
Well, yes, there have been cases reported of that happening.
One of the great things about Goblin Slayer is that the very beginning does the best job at explaining why Goblin Slayer even exists. The beautiful thing about this is that you pretty much know whether you'll like the Goblin Slayer series as a whole or not after experiencing the beginning. The first anime episode of Goblin Slayer is a perfect example of baptism by fire. In 20 minutes, you get shown in great detail what gets explained in subsequent episodes. It begins as a lighthearted first adventure among fresh adventurers. The episode shows the viewer all the red flags Goblin Slayer notices later as the adventurers travel through the cave. Then you see the consequences of poor preparation and ignorance and the explicit violence that follows. The contrast between the fairly lighthearted beginning that sets up the adventure and the unfortunate events that follow just serve to strengthen the impact of the scenes. In showing how bad the goblins are, the episode also shows how skilled Goblin Slayer is and how dangerous being an adventurer really is. Goblin Slayer explains everything to Priestess, and you get a taste for what's in his pocket as he cleans up what's left of the terrible mess. Whether the chapter or episode is enjoyed, despised, or leads to the entire series being banned like it was in some places, the worst case scenario portrayed in this episode is the perfect thesis for selling the true nature of a goblin problem most of the world just hears stories or rumors about. It also introduces Goblin Slayer's character, and you really do learn a lot about him in such a short time. For this reason, I think the first episode of Goblin Slayer is also one of the strongest episodes of anime I've ever seen in my 30 plus years of watching anime. While there are plenty of great anime series, only a very small number have a singular 20-minute episode that left such a memorable impression on me. It's still one of the most talked about episodes of anime, and sadly, probably the biggest reason the entire franchise is often reduced to it. The rest of Goblin Slayer is peppered with violence, but it never quite reaches the climactic levels of the beginning because the story mostly follows experienced adventurers or novices that are accepting quests more relevant to their skill levels, so they don't get into those situations. The reader's expectations are also at a more tolerant level after the first episode if they actually decide to stick around for more. In fact, the rest of the story may even betray some people's expectations for not being as explicit in its presentation as that first chapter. There's actually a lot more to Goblin Slayer than violent goblin slaying, like the slice of life moments where the storytelling moves to focus on characters running the guild or Goblin Slayer's childhood friend on the farm. Sometimes the perspective shifts to adventures of other adventurers too. It's not always dungeon crawling when it does shift focus. The exciting parts are definitely there, and it's inarguably a dark fantasy, but I wouldn't call Goblin Slayer as a whole an edgy, shocking story when series like Berserk and Game of Thrones exist. I'd say it's more like a collection of stories centered around a particular adventure with an unhealthy obsession and skill for killing goblins. There are definitely large threats looming, but at most Goblin Slayer is just the cleanup duty for what's being handled by the gold and platinum ranked heroes. The first season of the anime covers 2 volumes of the light novel. Each volume usually introduces new characters with a new story arc that changes the setting of the adventures. While Goblin Slayer almost always slays goblins, there's usually a twist to it where different enemies show up. The stories themselves are peppered with references to J.R.R. Tolkien and also tabletop gaming references to things like Shadowrun and Dungeons & Dragons. The real draw to Goblin Slayer's character are his candid interactions with the other characters and his incredible out-of-the-box solutions to very dangerous situations that are just entertaining to see unfold. He fights a lot like a ninja, constantly using different weapons to their limits, throwing them with practiced effectiveness, and using whatever he can get from the goblins or the environment. It's almost equally entertaining seeing Priestess's character develop into a strong, capable, and dangerous adventurer as a result of her association with Goblin Slayer too. Despite her lower adventurer rank, she often takes center stage in her adventures away from Goblin Slayer. The goblins themselves are of course regarded with complete disdain. Goblin Slayer himself never underestimates them, and they become particularly dangerous when they are organized. There are multiple examples of how they learn to use human technology throughout the story to surprise experienced adventurers and set traps that catch, injure, torment, or attempt to unnerve and disturb them. As dangerous as they are, the goblins look comically silly using human equipment or taking on special classes. The goblin fights often turn into battles of wits, usually ending in terrain-destroying events. Later in the story, Goblin Slayer deals with other dangerous enemies too, and while his experience is real, his ignorance with anything that isn't a goblin is actually pretty funny. The side stories cover interesting things like Sword Maiden's adventures as a gold-ranked adventurer with her old party, Goblin Slayer's beginnings under the tutelage of his master along with his first goblin slaying quests, and the adventures that other characters in this story are experiencing while Goblin Slayer is killing goblins. After you've read enough Goblin Slayer, you understand the meaning behind all of his eccentricities. There's even a side story when he's younger about how he saved the village that the growing hero lived in from goblins. Later on in the main light novel series, you actually meet the platinum ranked hero he saved, who is basically a Dragon Quest tier JRPG hero, and how easily she smokes high-level demons with overpowered cheater skills. Humorously, when she meets Goblin Slayer in the main light novel series, neither of them even recognize nor remember each other.
Oh, Orkbog! The hero's quest was successful!
That doesn't matter. It's time to slay some goblins.
It's things like this that give meaning to and define Goblin Slayer's status in the world. Goblin Slayer is by no means perfect. As expected from a story that doesn't even name their characters, there isn't much character development from anybody in the series other than Goblin Slayer, Priestess, and some minor characters that make cameos sporadically throughout the series. Despite the story having some really awesome character designs from illustrator Noboru Kanatsuki, it definitely isn't the kind of media that's going to get the anime cosplay community excited. On the plus side, while many of the characters don't develop much, the main characters in Goblin Slayer's party already have plenty of character, and their style of banter is like comfort food in contrast to Goblin Slayer's taciturn nature. Seeing as how these characters are already hundreds or even thousands of years old, it would be a little strange to see them develop so dramatically within the span of a few seasons or years. The Goblin Slayer tactical RPG is actually introducing a whole slew of new characters, including a fresh main character, Guildmaster, and even a new character that has an actual name, Conan. Given she has a real name in a world where everybody else is named after their race or job, I suspect she'll be an important part of the game's plot. While I hold low expectations for any video game based on an anime, the tactical RPG genre and involvement of Kumo Kagyu have me more excited for this one than usual. The overarching plot to Goblin Slayer might be leading to something. It probably involves a lot of pen and paper tabletop gameplay and dice rolling from gods that are probably not that different from D&D players. It makes talking about the story as a whole in a deep and meaningful way very difficult because it frankly isn't very deep and meaningful. That is why I think Goblin Slayer is a work of art, and my gamer brain loves it. It doesn't need to have an end or some huge importance. It just needs to have well-told stories with interesting character archetypes in a fantasy world that are entertaining to read or watch. The archetypes and the detached unnamed characters leave it up to the reader or watcher's imagination to interpret details like a good game of D&D or the famous pixel art versus photorealism debate that pervades discussions of aesthetics in video games. Goblin Slayer isn't pretending to be the hero. There's another overpowered character for that. Goblin Slayer is just another character archetype, probably a warrior scout hybrid with a bonus to fighting goblins and some sick throwing skills. Kumo Kagyu isn't William Shakespeare, nor is he J.R.R. Tolkien, but I think he's a good fantasy storyteller. I'm still reading the light novels at Volume 15, and even if I know the story already, I'm still excited to see Season 2 of the anime. While I have no experience with D&D or tabletop gaming, I'd probably just love Goblin Slayer even more if I did. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.